Before a death row inmate enters the execution chamber, they're given one last choice. Not about their fate that's already sealed, but about their final meal. Some indulge in a lavish feast, as if trying to savor their last moments. Others request bizarre or symbolic dishes, leaving behind mysteries that may never be solved. And then, there are those who reject it all, choosing to face death in complete silence. But what does a last meal really say about a person? Is it a final moment of reflection, or just one last act of defiance? Today, we explore the strangest and most haunting last meals in death row history. If you love gripping true crime stories, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a video. Victor Feguer, A Single Olive. March 15th, 1963. Victor Feguer walked to the gallows, becoming the last person to be executed in the state of Iowa. As the noose tightened around his neck, he left behind one of the strangest last meals in death row history. A single olive. No feast. No steak. No alcohol. Just one small olive. Simple, yet filled with meaning. But before we get to that peculiar choice, let's go back to the crime that sealed his fate. Feguer wasn't a serial killer. He didn't kill for pleasure. His crime began as a kidnapping for ransom scheme and ended in tragedy. In 1960, Feguer stole the identity of a doctor and lured another physician, Dr. Edward Bartels, under the pretense of needing medical help. But instead of saving a life, Dr. Bartels lost his own. Days later, his body was discovered in Illinois, a single bullet wound to the head. The motive behind the murder remains a mystery. Some believe Feguer thought the doctor could provide him with drugs. Others suggest it was a completely senseless killing. His trial moved swiftly. The evidence was overwhelming. A death sentence was handed down. At that time, Iowa had already stopped carrying out executions, but Feguer was made an exception. Even President John F. Kennedy was asked to grant clemency, but he refused. There was no way out. In his final days, Feguer remained calm. When asked about his last meal, he made a single request, one olive with the pit still inside. No one knew why. He offered no explanation, nor did he seem to care if anyone understood. Some speculated that he hoped an olive tree would grow from his grave, a symbol of peace and rebirth, a stark contrast to the crime he had committed. On the morning of his execution, Feguer ate his single olive. Then, he walked calmly to the gallows. After his body was removed, prison officials found the olive pit tucked inside his suit pocket. A quiet, final message to the world. A year later, Iowa officially abolished the death penalty, making Victor Feguer the last person to be executed in the state. He died in silence, but his last meal, just one solitary olive, cemented his place as one of the most enigmatic figures in death row history. 2. Lawrence Russell Brewer, a luxurious meal left untouched. September 21st, 2011. Lawrence Russell Brewer entered the Texas execution chamber. Lethal injection flowed through his veins, marking his final moments. But what made him infamous wasn't the crime he committed, it was the extravagant last meal that he never even touched. Brewer wasn't just any murderer. He was part of one of the most heinous hate crimes in modern American history. In 1998, Brewer and two accomplices kidnapped and brutally murdered James Bard Jr., a black man. They chained him to the back of a pickup truck and dragged him for more than 2.5 miles along a rural road. By the time authorities found Bard's remains, his body was unrecognizable. The crime shocked the nation. It became a symbol of racial violence, leading Texas lawmakers to pass stricter hate crime legislation. But Brewer He never showed remorse. Throughout his trial, he boasted about what he had done, even stating that he would do it again if given the chance. After 13 years on death row, he was given the opportunity to request his final meal. Instead of a simple request, he demanded a feast fit for royalty, 2 large steaks, 1 pound of barbecued meat, 3 chicken fajitas, a triple meat cheeseburger, a whole cheese pizza, 3 vanilla milkshakes, a bowl of ice cream, a plate of fried onions. Texas prepared every item exactly as requested, but when the meal arrived, Brewer took one look at it and refused to eat a single bite. No one knows exactly why. Was it a final act of defiance? Or just one last way to mock the justice system? Whatever his reason, his actions had lasting consequences. The very next day, Texas officials permanently abolished special last meal requests for all death row inmates. From that point forward, any prisoner awaiting execution would receive only the standard prison meal. Brewer showed no regret as he lay on the execution table. As the lethal injection took effect, his body fell still. Ironically, the lavish meal he had demanded sat untouched on a cold tray, just as lifeless as he was. 3. James Edward Smith, the man who asked for dirt. Texas, 1990. The execution chamber doors swung open. James Edward Smith stepped inside, facing the inevitable. He looked around, fully aware that no magic or ritual would save him now. Smith had once been a stockbroker, a career built on logic and numbers. But at some point, he veered down a very different path, a path of mysticism, magic, and the supernatural. In 1983, Smith walked into a bank in Houston. His intention? Robbery. But instead of simply taking the money and fleeing, he shot and killed bank teller Larry Rojas. Why? No one is entirely sure. Some believe he murdered Rojas to eliminate a witness. Others speculate that Smith saw it as part of a supernatural ritual, believing that the killing would grant him some kind of mystical power. The trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. Smith never tried to deny the charges, nor did he beg for mercy. When the death sentence was handed down, he showed no fear, no regret. Perhaps, in his mind, death wasn't an end. It was simply a transition to another realm. Before his execution, Smith was asked what he wanted for his final meal. But he didn't request steak, pizza, or dessert. Instead, he made a simple yet baffling request. A handful of dirt. Not to eat, not to smell. He wanted it to perform a purification ritual. One that, according to his beliefs, would cleanse his soul before he left this world. But the Texas prison system denied his request. A handful of dirt might seem harmless, but in Smith's world, it carried too much meaning. Instead, they gave him a cup of yogurt, a simple, unremarkable meal, devoid of any spiritual significance. Smith didn't protest, but he also never touched the yogurt as the lethal injection flowed through his veins. Smith didn't resist, didn't scream. He closed his eyes. No panic, no fear. It was as if he had been ready for this moment all along. 4. Philip Workman, The Last Meal for Others. Tennessee, May 9th, 2007. Most prisoners on death row see their last meal as a final privilege, one last indulgence before leaving this world. But Philip Workman chose something different. He didn't ask for food for himself, not because he wasn't hungry. He simply wanted his last meal to be given to people he had never even met, the homeless. Over 25 years earlier, in 1981, Workman entered a fast food restaurant in Memphis, Tennessee, intending to rob it. But what should have been a simple robbery spiraled into chaos when police arrived. A confrontation broke out. And in the midst of the tension, police officer Ronald Oliver was shot and killed. Workman was arrested immediately. At his trial, he insisted that the bullet that killed Officer Oliver did not come from his gun, but the jury didn't buy it. The evidence stacked against him was too strong. The verdict, guilty. The sentence, death. Years passed. Appeal after appeal failed. When his execution date was finally set, Workman prepared himself. But when asked what he wanted for his last meal, he didn't request anything extravagant. He didn't even want to eat. Instead, he made a request never before heard in the history of death row. Take the money that would have been spent on my last meal and use it to buy pizza for the homeless. It wasn't a publicity stunt. He didn't expect sympathy. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He simply wanted to do something meaningful in his final moments. But the Tennessee prison system refused. They didn't allow inmates to decide how state funds were used, even if it was for an act of generosity. Yet, Workman's story didn't end there. When news of his request spread, local residents were moved. They decided to do what the state would not. Pizza shops across Tennessee donated hundreds of pizzas to homeless shelters, honoring Workman's final wish. He may have left this world without a feast, without a final word. But in the end, his last meal wasn't about himself, because of his final request. 5. Ronnie Lee Gardner, A Final Meal with a Movie. Utah, 2010. Inside a small chamber, 4 riflemen stood at the ready. In front of them sat a heavy wooden chair, placed precisely in the center of a black tarp. This wasn't a typical execution. Ronnie Lee Gardner wasn't facing lethal injection or the electric chair. Instead, he had chosen a method nearly extinct in American history: death by firing squad. But before he faced the gunman, he had one last request. Gardner didn't just want a lavish meal. He wanted to extend his final hours as long as possible. On his tray sat a feast: lobster, steak, an apple, vanilla ice cream. But food wasn't the only thing on his mind. He asked to watch the entire Lord of the Rings film trilogy while enjoying his meal. This wasn't just a random movie pick. The trilogy is a sweeping tale of power, good versus evil, and an inescapable fate. Themes that seem to mirror Gardner's own life. But to understand why Gardner was sitting in front of a firing squad, we need to go back in time. In 1984, Ronnie Lee Gardner was already facing serious charges: armed robbery and violent assault. But instead of waiting for justice to take its course, he took matters into his own hands. During a courtroom hearing, Gardner grabbed a gun from a guard and started shooting. His botched escape attempt ended in tragedy. An innocent defense attorney, Michael Burdell, was shot and killed right inside the courthouse. Gardner was quickly overpowered and arrested again. This time, his trial was swift. With a violent criminal record and a murder inside a courtroom, there was little doubt about his fate. The sentence, death. But Gardner had one final choice. Utah remained one of the few states that still allowed execution by firing squad. And that's exactly what he chose. When asked why, his answer was chillingly simple: I lived by violence, so I will die by violence. After his final meal and an 11-hour movie marathon, Gardner was escorted to the execution chamber. He was strapped into the chair. A white target was placed over his heart to guide the shooters. Outside, the public debated whether the firing squad was too brutal, too archaic. Inside, Gardner didn't seem to care. No last words. No apologies. Just a slight nod. The command was given. 5 shots rang out. Silence. Ronnie Lee Gardner became one of the last people in the U.S. to be executed by firing squad. 6. John Wayne Gacy, a last meal filled with dark irony. Illinois, 1994. Inside a cold prison cell, John Wayne Gacy waited for the inevitable. Gone was the smiling clown persona. Gone were the nights of hunting victims. Now, there was only a middle-aged man staring down justice. Even in his final moments, Gacy had a choice. His last meal. His request was shockingly simple. Fried chicken from KFC, French fries, strawberries, Diet Coke. For some, it seemed like a normal fast food order, but for those who knew Gacy's story, it was deeply disturbing. Before becoming one of America's most infamous serial killers, Gacy had been a respected businessman. He managed 3 KFC restaurants. He wore a corporate uniform. He was once seen as a success story, but that life was long gone. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy kidnapped, tortured, and murdered at least 33 teenage boys and young men. Most of his victims were buried in the crawl space beneath his suburban home. A house that had once been a family home became a mass grave. Gacy never showed remorse. When police uncovered the horror beneath his house, he mocked them, saying, "Looks like my place turned into a funeral home." His trial was one of the biggest in U.S. history. The jury needed only a few hours to convict him. The verdict, guilty. The sentence, death. As the lethal injection flowed into his veins, Gacy remained emotionless. No fear, no regret. His final words, "Kiss my ass." And then, silence. Outside, a crowd gathered to celebrate his death. John Wayne Gacy left behind one of the most chilling criminal legacies in American history. And his final meal, a reminder of the normal life he once had, before he became a monster. 7. Angel Nieves, Diaz, the man who ate nothing. Florida, December 13th, 2006. Inside the execution chamber at Florida State Prison, Angel Nieves, Diaz, lay motionless on the lethal injection gurney. Unlike many inmates before him, some who begged for mercy, some who trembled in fear, and others who met death with defiance, Diaz chose absolute silence. But the most unusual thing about his final moments wasn't his last words. It was the meal he never ate. Born in Puerto Rico, Diaz lived a life of crime, moving between states, leaving behind a trail of illegal activity. But it was one particular night in 1979 that sealed his fate. That night, Diaz and his accomplices broke into a bar in Miami, intending to rob the place. But things didn't go as planned. A struggle broke out. And during the chaos, the bar's manager, Joseph Nagy, was shot and killed. When authorities investigated, Diaz was arrested almost immediately. He denied being the shooter, but the court ruled otherwise. After nearly 3 decades of failed appeals, his execution date was finally set. By Florida prison policy, Diaz was entitled to request his last meal, but he refused. Prison staff still prepared a standard meal, a simple tray of whatever food was being served to inmates that day. When the tray was placed before him, Diaz never touched a single bite. No one knew why, but the most chilling part of Diaz's story wasn't his refusal to eat. It was how he died. Lethal injections are meant to be quick and painless. For Diaz, it was anything but. Due to a botched injection, the chemicals missed his veins, causing the drugs to be absorbed into his soft tissue instead. For 34 excruciating minutes, Diaz gasped, grimaced, and writhed in pain, his body slowly shutting down as the drugs took effect. By the time his heart finally stopped, the room had fallen silent. 8. Ray Rector, the pie left for later. Arkansas, 1992. Inside Cummins Prison, Ray Rector sat at a small table. Before him was his last meal: a steak, fried chicken, a glass of lemonade, a slice of pecan pie. He ate almost everything, except for one thing. He left the pecan pie untouched. When a guard asked if he wanted to finish it, Rector simply smiled and said, "I'm saving it for later." No one said a word. No one reminded him that there would be no later. To understand why Rector said something so childlike, just hours before his execution, we need to look at the crime that put him here. In 1981, Rector was wanted for murdering a man during an argument. When police arrived to arrest him, he pretended to surrender, then suddenly pulled out a gun and shot Officer Robert Martin in the head. The officer died instantly. Rector fled. But instead of going into a shootout or taking his own life, he did something completely unexpected. He shot himself in the head, but he didn't die. The bullet destroyed part of his frontal lobe, and though doctors saved his life, he was never the same. His mental capacity was permanently altered, leaving him childlike, detached, and unable to fully grasp reality. Did he even understand he was about to die? By the time his trial began, experts debated whether he was mentally competent enough to be executed, but the jury decided he was fit for execution after years of failed appeals. His time finally ran out, and that's when he uttered the words that left prison staff shaken. "I'm saving the pie for later." It was as if he truly believed there would be another meal, another tomorrow. When the lethal injection was administered, he showed no resistance. Some witnesses believed he didn't even understand what was happening to him. A last meal is more than just a final privilege. It's a reflection of a person's psychology, their personality, and even their final thoughts before facing death. Some chose to indulge in a lavish feast, as if making a bold farewell statement. Others left behind a cryptic message, turning their last request into an unsolved mystery. And then there were those who refused everything, as if food no longer mattered, when the end was inevitable. But no matter what they chose, one thing remained the same. They all had to face the consequences of their crimes. These stories raise thought-provoking questions. Does a person truly feel remorse when confronted with death, or do some leave this world without an ounce of guilt? However we interpret these last meals, they serve as a final imprint of those who left their mark on criminal history. What do you think? What do you think about these choices? Which last meal stood out to you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you love gripping true crime stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notification so you never miss another video. See you in the next story.